So this time last week, I was at the NEASC Leadership Conference in Boston. It was long awaited. It was a long journey to get there from Hamburg, but oh my goodness, I was so glad I got to go. Had a stopover in Amsterdam and saw this weird tornado thing outside my plane window before we took off, which didn't at all terrify me as someone who's not massively keen on flying. But I had been looking forward to this conference for the longest time and doing a lot of preparation for it, which hopefully would pay off. Now, the state of New York holds many important people for me, so I made sure to arrive early for the conference so I would have a day or so to get a feel for Boston, the hometown of NEASC, and get a sense of the area and not just fly in and fly out, but also to see a very important friend I hadn't seen for 6 years, have some local delicacies, and try all of the Boston cuisine while I was there. I can say that the clam chowder was great. And then it was finally time for the Asian music industry Okay, I'm only joking. We just took that picture for a laugh. But jokes aside, I did get quite ill on the Saturday before the conference, so a big thank you to Trillium and George for reaching out and making sure I was okay as I rested on Sunday. But by Monday, I was raring to go and deliver the visitor skills training with Athena. It was a poignant moment for me as I reflected on doing the training last year with Darlene Fisher. I even got a chance to have a glimpse at the stage for tomorrow and then treat myself to some Shake Shack for the evening. I got ready in the morning, nervous as anything, and ready to go on stage and open the conference for the workshops. Good morning, everyone. It's like leading a class. So, a bit of a surprise start today. My name, as you can see, is Darryl Sinclair, and it's a real honor to be the opening speaker for the conference this year. So to give a quick introduction for myself, I am, it's a powerful phrase, I am. When I use this phrase, I have the opportunity to draw a circle. Now that circle can either include me, or it can include us. It can invite, connect, and make space for belonging. Or it can exclude and set the limits for the rest of our interaction. A big thank you to Athena for getting these clips and proving that I wasn't giving a speech to an empty room. I also promised that the stumble at the start was part of the show, just to get you into the speech. But let's hear the end. So let's draw inclusive circles with our aspirations so that together we can meet this moment in education. Thank you for having me. It was a real honor to be able to speak about ideas which were so close to my heart and so central to the work that I do, and to have it well received. But after hopping on the mic one last time and saying a massive thank you and congratulations to Kelly for a fantastic conference, it was in a taxi straight back to Hamburg. It was a smooth journey back, and all the flights were nice and easy, with some really beautiful skies as we arrived in Amsterdam. The vista was perfect, and after another rush through Amsterdam airport, I quickly found myself back home in Hamburg, and yes, with my luggage. A quick hop on the bus, and I was back home to be able to rest and recover from a brilliant experience. So all that's left to do now is to rest over the holiday break. I hope everyone gets time with their families. And of course, I hope to see you all at the conference in Dubai next year in February. I'll be posting about that soon. Take care.